Beneath the mountains of Appalachia, there are stories whispered in hushed tones, stories so strange that even those who live closest to them pretend they never heard them at all. But sometimes the land itself remembers. In crumbling houses tucked deep into the woods, in the bones buried under collapsing cabins, in the diaries hidden in attics no one has touched for 100 years. There are fragments of lives too dark to fit neatly into history books. Tonight, I'll tell you one of them. It begins with a woman who was never allowed to choose her own destiny. She was not just a bride, she was a possession, and she did not belong to one man, but to three. The story is not a simple one, because nothing about these lives was ever simple. Poverty, isolation, and silence became the soil where secrets grew. Out here, when the outside world turned its back, families turned inward, closing ranks, crossing lines, and forging unions that never should have been. The result was a house that stood for generations, built not on love, but on necessity, coercion, and fear. This is where one woman was shared, traded like a secret no one dared to speak of, until whispers escaped the hollows and the truth began to take shape. Her name has been lost, erased by time and shame. But in the fragments of testimony, in the records that remain, we can piece together her life. She was born into hardship, like so many Appalachian daughters. There was no school to speak of, no chance of escape, no strangers coming down the mountain to intervene. By the time she reached her teenage years, her fate was already sealed. She was promised not to a suitor, but to a family, to brothers, to men who shared not just a roof, but a bloodline. The first union might have been explained away by need. A family needed heirs. A woman was needed to bear them. But when a single bride became the wife to multiple men, the pattern was too clear to ignore. These were not choices made out of love. They were arrangements bound in secrecy and silence. The men who called her wife were bound to each other by blood, and through her, they bound the family ever tighter, twisting generation after generation into a knot that could never be untangled. This is not a story of romance. It is a story of survival, and of what survival can demand when the world outside forgets you exist. The cabin where they lived still stood long after the family inside it was gone. Locals who passed by whispered that it had a kind of heaviness to it, as if the air itself refused to move. Its roof sagged, its boards rotted, but the walls remembered. And what those walls had seen was a life few would believe. 3 men, brothers, sharing one bride, living under the same roof, raising children who bore the marks of both inheritance and entrapment. The arrangement was never written down. No marriage certificate spelled out her fate, but oral histories in these mountains often hold truths that paper never dares to capture. Old neighbors, now long dead, recalled the strange household. They spoke of her as quiet, eyes downcast, a woman who rarely spoke above a whisper. She cooked, she cleaned, she bore children, but no one ever called her happy. Some claimed she aged twice as fast as other women, her face lined with sorrow before her 30th year. The men, however, were described differently, fierce, jealous, quick-tempered, yet bound to one another, as though their shared possession of her made them inseparable. Outsiders who visited the home said there was an unspoken rule among them. What happened within those walls was never to be questioned. If one brother claimed a night with her, the others looked away. If children were born with features too closely resembling all of them, no one dared to speak of it. The children themselves became the clearest evidence of what had taken place. Their faces bore the unmistakable signatures of close kinship. Some were sickly, frail from birth. Others seemed to thrive for a time, only to wither away before adulthood. In the hills of Appalachia, such things were often explained away as curses, bad blood, or simply misfortune. But the truth was far more unsettling. The bloodline had been folded in on itself, generation after generation, and until it could no longer bear its own weight. The woman, caught in the center, became both mother and prisoner. To the children, she was a caretaker. To the men, she was a necessity. But in her heart, she was something else entirely. A ghost in her own life, a figure trapped in a story that offered no escape. She lived in silence, but her silence spoke louder than any words she could have uttered. And when people remembered her, they did not remember her laughter or her kindness, but her stillness. The way her presence filled a room with something heavy, something unsaid, something that never left. Generations later, the descendants of that union carried the proof of what had been done. Their bodies bore the signatures of a family folded in upon itself. Narrow chests, twisted spines, jaws that did not align, features that marked them as different from the families who lived just a valley away. In these mountains, differences were rarely spoken aloud. People noticed, but they said nothing. Silence had become the law of survival here, but whispers traveled, and those whispers always circled back to the same cabin, the same story, the same bride who had been forced to belong to 3 men. What makes this tale more haunting is that it was not unique. The isolation of Appalachia, with its miles of ridges and its roads that never reached beyond the hollows, created a breeding ground for secrecy. Families depended only on themselves, and when generations passed without outsiders, the lines blurred. Brothers became husbands, cousins became brides, children carried the weight of choices they never made. But in this particular family, the extremes were pushed further than most dared. 3 men binding themselves to one woman was not just an arrangement, it was a ritual of control, a way to lock her life down so that no part of her could ever leave. In the stories that survived, there are glimpses of how the children lived. Some were said to wander barefoot, avoiding the eyes of strangers. Others hid when visitors came, as if instructed never to show their faces to outsiders. A few grew into adulthood but never left the valley, marrying back into the same dwindling pool of kin. And so the cycle continued, each generation thinning, weakening, until the family became known not for their survival, but for their deformities, their sickness, their unshakable strangeness. And yet for those who study the past, what strikes hardest is not the physical evidence but the psychology beneath it. Imagine a woman bound to 3 men she could never call her own. Imagine the jealousies, the unspoken rules, the nights filled with silence and fear. And imagine the children growing up knowing their family was different, but never daring to say how or why. This was not just a house of inbreeding. It was a house of shadows, a place where time itself seemed to bend, trapping every soul who entered within the same unbearable story. By the early 20th century, when modernization crept slowly into the Appalachian valleys, outsiders began to take note of this family. Traveling preachers, census takers, and health workers sometimes found themselves at the cabin's door. What they saw disturbed them, though few had the courage to write it down plainly. Official records noted peculiar households, children born without fathers listed, strange repetitions of surnames within the same family tree. But between the lines, a darker truth revealed itself, an entire lineage circling endlessly inward, bound by a pact no one dared to break. For the bride who had been forced into this unnatural role, time had already passed her by. She grew old in that house, the men who once fought over her now grey and hollow themselves. Yet she remained trapped, her name never leaving the valley, her life reduced to whispers that carried farther than she ever could. Some claimed she went silent in her final years, refusing to speak altogether. Others said she wept at night, her cries carrying into the trees where no one dared to follow. If she ever dreamed of freedom, those dreams died with her. But the echoes of her life lived on in her children and grandchildren. They inherited more than her eyes or her voice. They inherited the curse of what had been done to her. Doctors who later examined the descendants recorded signs of genetic collapse, fragile immune systems, strange bone structures, minds clouded by disorders that were not understood at the time. To the outside world, these people were seen as freakish, even monstrous, but the truth was simpler and crueler. They were not monsters, they were victims of decisions made in a cabin far from the eyes of the world, where one woman had been turned into a vessel for survival. The family became a living warning, a story told by neighbors as both gossip and caution. Children and nearby towns were warned never to wander into that hollow, never to stare too long if they caught a glimpse of the family walking down a dirt road. Fear and shame sealed the story shut, as though speaking of it too openly might awaken the curse itself. And yet, behind the silence, the truth remained. 3 men, 1 bride, and a legacy carved into the very bodies of their bloodline. If you walk through those valleys today, the house is gone. Nothing remains but a scatter of stones where the foundation once stood, swallowed by weeds and time. But the story lingers like smoke that refuses to clear. Locals still recall it when pressed, though their voices drop, as if afraid the trees themselves might be listening. They say the family's bloodline eventually withered, collapsing in on itself until there were no heirs left to carry it on. The curse, if you choose to call it that, fulfilled itself in silence. Yet even as the family vanished, their memory persisted as a shadow on the land. Researchers digging into Appalachian history came across fragments, census pages where a woman's name is crossed out without explanation, school records with children listed as unfit, birth certificates that omitted fathers altogether. Each piece by itself looks unremarkable, but when stitched together, they reveal the outline of a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. A family built on a union that defied both morality and biology. Some insist there were survivors who moved away, carrying the bloodline into towns and cities where no one knew their story. They blended in, their names lost among thousands, their faces just a little different, their children carrying a past they never knew. It's a haunting thought that the line may not have ended, only scattered, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most. We like to believe that stories like this belong to the past, confined to the shadows of old Appalachia. But what if they never truly ended? What if the legacy of that bride and her 3 husbands still flows quietly through veins alive today? This is where the story grips hardest, because it forces us to ask, was she a victim of circumstance, or the foundation of a house that should never have been built? Did she accept her fate in silence? Oh, or did she resist in ways history never recorded? We will never know. All that remains is the heavy echo of her life, carved into the memories of neighbors, recorded only in hints and whispers, but undeniable in its effect. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The Appalachian Mountains have always hidden their secrets well. Caves, hollows, and winding roads become vaults for stories too dark to tell, and yet every now and then a fragment escapes. A yellowed photograph of a family whose faces don't quite look like they should. A gravestone where birth and death are separated by only a handful of years. A diary line that hints at shame without naming it. These fragments are all that remain of the most inbred house of Appalachia, where 3 men shared 1 bride. The unsettling truth is that this was not an isolated tragedy. Across forgotten corners of America, poverty and isolation created conditions where morality was bent, where survival pushed families to cross lines that should never have been crossed. But in this case, the cruelty of the arrangement made it unforgettable. A single woman, stripped of her choice, turned into a vessel for her family's continuation. 3 men who should have been her protectors instead became her captors. And a lineage that should have grown strong instead grew brittle, collapsing under the weight of its own secrecy. What makes this story so haunting is that history did not protect her. No church intervened, no state official stopped the unions, neighbors looked away. Everyone knew, and no one spoke. And in that silence, the family was allowed to continue, generation after generation, until the evidence was carved into the very bones of their children. That silence was not just complicity, it was the soil in which this house of shadows thrived. Today, when we look back on stories like these, we are forced to confront something uncomfortable, that forgotten families are not forgotten by accident. They are forgotten because remembering them would force us to face the ugliest parts of ourselves, the cruelty of isolation, the desperation of poverty, the ways in which human beings can imprison each other not with chains, but with silence, expectation, and blood. The woman at the center of this story will never have her name restored. Her face is gone, her voice is gone, but her life remains a warning, a reminder that some histories are buried not because they are unimportant, but because they are unbearable. And yet, here we are, digging them back up, looking them in the eye, refusing to let them be erased. And so we arrive at the end of her story, though in truth there is no true ending. The woman who lived as a bride to 3 men never escaped the walls that bound her. She died as she lived, unknown, unnamed, and unfree. Her life was a cage, and her children carried the bars of that cage in their blood. But in remembering her now, we force the silence to break. We peel back the boards nailed over her story and let the light fall where it was never meant to. The house of Appalachia, where 3 men shared one bride, was more than just a scandal. It was a symptom of what happens when poverty and isolation close in, when survival twists into something unnatural. It was not just a family tragedy, but a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human endurance. The men believed they were preserving their line, but in reality, they were dismantling it, one generation at a time. What lingers most is not their names, nor the specifics of who fathered which child. What lingers is the atmosphere, the heavy air of that cabin, thick with jealousy, resignation, and silence. The children staring from darkened doorways, too wary to meet the eyes of strangers. The woman carrying a weight no person should ever bear, her story dissolved into whispers until even her name was taken by time. When we tell her story now, it is not for curiosity alone. It is to acknowledge the cost of forgotten lives, the pain buried beneath American soil. These mountains hold more than coal and timber, they hold ghosts, and this bride is one of them. Her silence speaks to us across generations, warning us that when we look away, when we refuse to name what we see, we become accomplices to suffering. So as you leave this story behind, remember that history is not made only of kings and wars, but of forgotten women, trapped in places where no one dared to look. Her life was consumed by silence, but her memory survives in the fragments that remain. And now in telling it, we have done what her world refused to do. We have seen her, we have remembered, and we will not look away.